So it was 3.5 years ago that Kathy and I moved here to Arizona. I came in the month of October, a month earlier than Kathy. I went back to Lincoln, Nebraska, picked her up, and we drove here with both of our dogs in the back of the van at that time. And as we got home, Kathy started looking through her new house, and dogs had to go out back, so I went out back. And I'll tell you, during the first month here by myself, what I discovered was I lived in a very quiet neighborhood. Not too many children, extremely quiet on the outside. And so I'm out in the backyard this night after having driven back from Lincoln, Nebraska, and all of a sudden I heard all this screaming. I have never heard children screaming so loud, off in the distance, and I'm just going, I cannot believe 30 days here, it has been so peaceful, and tonight it's just so loud. And as I stood out there with my dogs, I noticed, I said, I wonder, are these kids happy or are these kids sad? Are they mad at each other or what? And the more I listened, the more I thought, I think what they're doing is they're calling each other names. Now, I don't know if, there was bad name calling or good name calling, but that's what it sounded like to me. And the longer I stood there, there was only one name. It's kind of ironic. Only one name I could make out of all the kids yelling, and it was the name Jim. And I said, that's ironic that would be the case. And the more I stood there, I said, and it must be some young girl that's doing that. Jim! And I said, irony upon ironies. That young lady actually even sounded like my wife. And so as I was bringing dogs back to the house, I had left the door open, the back door open. As I got to the house, I realized something. That screaming wasn't coming from outside the house. That screaming was coming from inside the house. Jim! I found my wife in one of our downstairs bathrooms cornered by a scorpion. And she didn't know what a scorpion could do. She didn't know how to get out of the bathroom. Jim! Oh, man. It took me so long to respond to, Jim! I'll never live that down. I'll never live that one down. But one tradition that we have here at Sun City West is that we all wear name tags. And I think that is just outstanding. In fact, our new members will get church name tags. And we wear that. And, I think names are very important. They're important to us. I've heard it said that the sweetest sound to anyone is the sound of their own name. Doesn't it make you feel good when somebody remembers your name? And the question I have for you this morning is, do you think that God knows your name? See, I think he does. I think he knows each and every one of our names because names are important to God as well. Read through the scriptures sometime. I'm just going to give you a few examples. One day Moses, he sees this burning bush, right? He went over to take a look, and God called to Moses from inside the bush, Moses, Moses. And what Moses answered, here I am, Lord. As Jesus walked down the streets of Jericho one day, he stopped, he looked up in a tree, and what did he say? He said, Zacchaeus, come down right now, I'm going to your house today. And when Jesus called out his name, Zacchaeus came down from the tree. Before the Apostle Paul became Paul, his name was Saul. And as he was headed down the road to Damascus on a mission, his goal was to persecute disciples. A bright light flashed around him. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice from heaven say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul answered, who are you, Lord? And then one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story that Linda read to you this morning about a boy named Samuel. You may remember that Samuel's mother was a woman by the name of Hannah. She wanted a son more than anything else. So she prayed and asked God to give her a son. And she promised God that if he would give her a son, she would give him back to the Lord to serve God all the days of his life. And God gave Hannah the son for whom she asked, and in return, Hannah kept her promise to God. And when the boy was old enough, she took him to the temple in Shiloh and presented him to Eli the priest. And he was to be mentored by Eli. He was to be raised by Eli with Eli's children. And so Samuel served in the temple under Eli. So here's where we pick up the story where Linda began reading this morning. The boy Samuel was ministering, the text says, to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. And at that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim, in other words, he's going blind, was lying down in his room late at night. The text says the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and we'll look at that a little bit more closely in a moment. And Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. And then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And you see, once again, God knew Samuel's name. Now, the amazing thing is that Samuel, unlike myself that night when my wife needed me so badly, calling, Jim, Jim, Samuel actually was listening. Unfortunately, many people today are more like me. They're not listening. A New York columnist who was writing an article for one of the New York papers was writing about how people listen today. And he set out to prove that no one really listens to what other people say. And so he did an experiment at a cocktail party to which he had received an invitation. Now, every time that he had been invited to these cocktail parties, he always arrived fashionably late. And when he arrived for this particular cocktail party, the hostess greeted him and then gave him an opportunity to explain why he was late. And this was his explanation. Now listen, I had to stop along the way to murder my mistress, and it took longer than I thought. Now, without blinking an eye, the hostess said she perfectly understood. I was almost late myself. Everyone is quite busy. Enjoy yourself and have a good time. Now, that's amazing. She wasn't listening. She was preoccupied with herself. And that's the problem with the world today. We're so preoccupied with ourselves that we're not listening for God and we're not listening to one another. And as the columnist continued to mingle at that party, someone asked him what he did for a living. And he said, oh, I'm the executioner at the state penitentiary. And the person, without any reaction, simply said, well, that must be an interesting line of work. How does business look this year? Nope. Nobody listens, even to the people who are important to us. A young woman tells of a time when her father went for a 3-week vacation over to London, England. He called one evening after about a week just to see how his daughter was doing, and the phone line had some static on it. And for the life of her, the daughter said that she just couldn't recognize her father's voice. She heard the person ask her, how are you doing, hon? And she responded positively, but had really no clue with whom she was speaking. Her grandmother, with whom she was staying, was in the exact same room when she hung up the phone. And her grandmother saw this puzzled look on her granddaughter's face and asked her what's wrong. And the granddaughter explained, someone just called checking up on me and I have no clue who it was. Her grandmother asked if it was a male, and she said yes. And then her grandmother asked what the person's exact words were. And then her grandmother said, that was your father. Don't you recognize your own father's voice, even if there's static on the telephone line? Well, I suspect all of us have been stumped at one time or another when somebody called us and didn't identify themselves. My mother-in-law, she actually calls our home, and if I'm there along with Michael and with Ben, and one of us picks up, she does not know to which of the three she is speaking. She always has to clarify. Is this Michael? Is this Benjamin? Is this Jim? Well, that confusion happened to a young boy by the name of Samuel. It wasn't a phone call with static on the line. No, he simply heard a voice in the middle of the night. You hear voices in the middle of the night? He heard a voice in the middle of the night. Now, he's living in the temple of Shiloh. It's late at night. The writer of the book of 1 Samuel reports, and remember, here's that phrase, the lamp of God had not yet gone out. Now, what does that mean? The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Actually, that's a phrase that could mean one of two things. It might simply mean that this incident happened very late at night. Because, you see, the only light in the temple was a candle that was hanging very high up in the temple ceiling. And it was still burning. But at this late hour, it was obviously near the point when it would soon burn out. And then it would be dark for the rest of the night until it was lit the next morning. So the phrase, the lamp of God had not yet gone out, could refer for that candle that was burning and hanging from the ceiling of the temple. But on the other hand, let's consider this. The phrase could have had a much more symbolic meaning. Eli, the high priest, you see, he was at an advanced age. He was old, and he was nearly blind. But you have to know this about his sons. His sons were about ready to take over for Eli when he died, but they were known to be scoundrels. Scoundrels who had abused their roles as priests. Eli's sons were, quote, moral misfits, unquote, who had no business taking over the temple duties after Eli passed on. So the writer may have been saying that even though the worship of God at Shiloh was not what it was supposed to be because of the leadership there, God was still dwelling there. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. He hadn't removed his presence from the temple. His light still shone, even though dimly. Whatever the phrase means, either one, Samuel heard a voice, the voice of the Lord. Now, you will recall that Samuel was in the temple. Why? Because of a promise that his mother had made. Hannah, Samuel's mother, was one of two wives of a man named Elkanah. Now, it's a situation that seems to occur as we read through the Old Testament, that a man marries two wives, and one wife, and the other wife in this situation was Peninnah. She was prolific at having babies. And babies back then were considered a blessing. But Hannah, she could not get pregnant, no matter what. Peninnah didn't try to console Hannah. She taunted Hannah unmercifully about this. And Hannah would weep, and she would pray incessantly that God would one day give her a child so that she might bless her husband. Her husband, Elkanah, would try to reassure her. He would often say, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you so disheartened? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? But his reassurances fell on deaf ears. One day, Hannah was at the temple of Shiloh. She was on her knees, praying fervently for a child. And it was that day that she made a promise to God. And maybe you've made a promise to God in similar fashion. She prayed, Lord, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you. And she was moving her lips as she prayed. But you know how sometimes you can move your lips and pray, but you're not really saying anything out loud. Eli was watching her that day as she prayed so passionately, moving her lips without making any sound. You know what he thought? He thought that here, early in the morning, she must be drunk. He said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk, young woman? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply distressed. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant to be a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of great anguish and grief. And Eli, I think here was one place where he showed some wisdom and I think some compassion. He answered, well, then go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And she said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. And then, says the writer, she went away. She finally ate something, and her face was no longer downcast because finally she was filled with hope of bearing a son. And the Lord did give Hannah the desire of her heart. They named the boy Samuel. What an interesting name. Do you know what Samuel means? You know what Samuel means? Samuel means, I begged from the Lord. I begged from the Lord. And after he was weaned, I mean, this is not very long into his life, Hannah placed Samuel under the care of the elderly priest Eli at the temple of Shiloh to fulfill the promise that she had made to the Lord. Now, some years later, as we pick up the story, Samuel's maybe 11, 12 years of age. He's lying on his bed in the house of the Lord late at night when he hears a voice calling to him. Samuel assumed the voice belonged to Eli. I mean, you can imagine that this probably happened on a regular basis because Eli, being almost blind, probably called on Samuel quite often. Hey, go get me a cup of cold water. Help me walk to such and such a place, like maybe even the bathroom. Help to get him things that he needed in the middle of the night because he couldn't see. And so Samuel ran into Eli's room, and as he was accustomed to doing, and said, "Here I am, you called me?" But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down, you silly boy." So he went back and he lay down. Again, the voice called, "Samuel." Now, think about this. You're laying in your bed late at night, and all of a sudden you hear a voice. I think, one, we'd either be frightened or we would be extremely bothered because we don't like to be awoken in the middle of the night. But Samuel simply got up, he did his duty, he went to Eli, because this is what he was trained to do, and he said, "Here I am, you called me?" "My son," said Eli, "I did not call you, go back and lie down." Then the writer explains a very key component to the story. He says, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him." Now that's striking, that's stunning, that's hard to believe, because it suggests how ineffective Eli and his sons had been as priests in mentoring Samuel. He'd been there for like a decade. And Samuel, under Eli's direct tutelage, did not yet know the Lord after 10 years. A third time the voice called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and he went to Eli and he said, "Here I am, you called me?" And this time Eli realized that Samuel was hearing the voice of the Lord calling him. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and he lay down in his place. And the Lord came again and stood there, calling out, just like he had other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel answered, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Would you have had the faith to do such a thing? To say, "Speak, for your servant is listening." See, this is a beautiful story. Many of us learned this story as children, I'm sure, in Sunday school. But it's an important story because it's about the call of Samuel. And he answered the call. When it came and the Lord spoke, he said, "Here I am, Lord." Because Samuel would later become a judge of Israel, one of its most important prophets. In fact, he was the last of Israel's judges and the first of its prophets. Remember, it was Samuel who anointed King Saul and King David to be kings. He had an important role to play throughout the Old Testament. He played that role thanks to a mother's promise and his own openness to the voice of God. Of course, we are interested in what the story means for us as well in our lives. Well, first of all, it reminds us of the importance for each and every one of us to be listening for God and listening to one another. Most of us will not be hearing mysterious voices in the night, at least I hope not. I did read recently that according to recent research, the experience of hearing voices is not all that unusual. Estimates suggest that more than half of the normal people have heard strange voices at some time or another, while there are about 4% of the population that hears voices regularly. Now, you may think that you've never experienced anything like this, but I wonder if you're sure. You may have had the experience of hearing someone call your name and then looking and not finding anyone there. Indeed, research shows that especially for recently bereaved people who have lost someone very close to them in death, it is not uncommon to hear the voice of that someone that they love after they are deceased. So bottom line, hearing voices does not necessarily mean that you've got problems, though it certainly can. And if you ever do hear voices and the voices tell you to do something violent, don't do it. Okay, don't do it. Though God may call out your name as he did to Moses and Zacchaeus and Saul and Samuel, I think it's important to note that when God speaks to us, it is rarely in an audible voice. You'll remember the story in 1 Kings about a prophet named Elijah who was told by the Lord to wait on a mountaintop. And then a great and powerful wind tore that mountain apart. But God was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a whisper. And God was in that gentle whisper. Because you see, God sometimes speaks through a very gentle whisper to each and every one of us. Generally, God speaks in the quietness of our own hearts. I believe that the Holy Spirit speaks to our conscience. Rabbi Bert Vysotsky, he was in a Bill Moyer's PBS program. They were discussing Genesis at one point, and I'll quote Bert. He says, I'm actually surprised to be surrounded by people who so readily hear voices. I'm a praying Jew. So I talk to God all the time, but I don't usually hear answers. It's a more subtle process with me. God may tell Abraham and Sarah to get up and go and change everything about their lives, but nobody ever says to me, if I hear God at all, it's somewhere between the lines of a page that I've been studying for hours, maybe as I'm reading the Torah, and all I ever hear is, Bert, turn the page. Well, that's the way it is for most. I like that. I don't know. I like that one. That's the way it is for most of us. God most often speaks to us without words. He speaks through our life experiences. He speaks to us in the silence of our own thoughts after a time of laying out our needs and concerns before God. He speaks to us through other people. He speaks to us during our prayer time. And that's the importance of prayer. We come before God with our needs and concerns. God already knows those concerns before we name them, but it is still important that we bring them to Him. But it's also important that we pause and we wait a few moments to see if God has something to say to us. Remember, God has concerns too. God's concerned about how we are living our lives. God is concerned maybe about someone in our family who needs our attention. God is concerned about something that needs to be done at the church, like taking care of roses. It may be a concern of what's happening in the world, say like what happened in Nepal this past week. Give God a chance to speak to you. Take time in your prayer life to listen. What is God calling you to do? And it's also important that we listen to one another. Mark Merrill writes about family relationships in his book, and he was writing about multitasking. He says that multitasking can be a good thing. But when it comes to relationships, maybe multitasking is not so good. Merrill was sitting in his family room, and he asked his daughter a question about one of her friends. And without looking at him, she gave him a one-word answer and then went on to do something else. He then asked her if she was listening to him. And she said, yes, I'm just multitasking. Well, that ticked him off. And so he explained to his daughter how he felt so unimportant when she did not give him her full attention when they were talking. Then it hit him. I wonder how many times I've done that to her. You see, we all know what he's talking about. We rarely give each other our full attention. Two men were talking over coffee one day. One said, I'm very concerned about my wife. She talks to herself a lot these days. And the other says, mine does too, but she doesn't know it. She thinks I'm listening. Yeah. No one in this room will be surprised if I say that this is the biggest complaint of most women, including my wife. He doesn't listen to me. So it's important that we listen. As we come to prayer the next time, we have a quiet moment, and we're meditating, we're reflecting with God. Take a moment to listen. And don't do this like once every 6 months. Do this like at least once a day. Maybe 3 times a day. Maybe if you get really good at it as you're just going through life and situations arise, pay attention to what God might be whispering to your heart or to your mind, what God is calling you to do. You know, that night, God called, Samuel, Samuel, because as I've already listed, he had some very important things for Samuel to do. And Samuel must have responded that night, here I am, Lord, use me. I believe that in each and every one of our lives, at just the right time and just the right place, God comes to each and every one of us and calls us by name. Jim, I need you. And don't do what I did on the night my wife needed me. Actually listen to God. Respond to God. Think about what God is asking you to do. And say, Lord, speak. Your servant is listening. And once the Lord speaks, I hope that you can respond. Here I am.